Okay. It looks like the mic is on. Welcome, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for being here. I am here to introduce our tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Luhui Whitebear. I know Dr. Whitebear from my work with the Corvallis School District, and she is one of our board chairs on the school board, and that's how we both ended up here, is through that connection. So Dr. Whitebear is a member of the Coastal Band of the Chumash Nation. She is an assistant professor for the School of Language, Culture, and Society at Oregon State University and serves as the center director of the Kaku-Ixt Mana Ina Haws. She received her PhD in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies with a graduate minor in Queer Studies from Oregon State. Prior to starting her role with the Cultural Resources Center on campus in 2013, Dr. Whitebear served as the College Advising and Scholarship Coordinator for the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. She volunteers as co-chair of the Corvallis School Board, as I mentioned, Region 4 Director of the Oregon School Board Member of Color Caucus, and is a board member for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women USA. Dr. Whitebear is also a mother, a poet, an activist, and she is passionate about disrupting systems of oppression and creating positive change in society. She's involved in the community in so many ways. Her research focuses on Indigenous rhetorics, indigeneity, and reclaiming Indigenous identity, gender roles, murdered and missing Indigenous women, the subject of tonight's talk, Indigenous resistance movements, and national laws and policies that impact Indigenous people. The topic she will address this evening is not widely recognized by the American media, but it is considerable. Violence against women has been a long-standing issue that needs to be addressed in the United States, and for some women, this violence is more prevalent. Indigenous women face the highest rates per capita out of any other race. The current data available provides context that illustrates the necessity of community engagement in increasing awareness and addressing all types of violence against Indigenous women. Holocaust Memorial Week often includes presentations on comparative genocide and also sponsors events on major episodes of human rights abuse. The topic of Dr. Whitebear's talk this evening is not only human rights abuse, but also sexual assault. Please join me in welcoming her here this evening. Thanks.
Does this sound okay? Okay. It sounded really echoey for me. When I heard the news your baby was found, my spirit cried. Another sister disappeared. Holding our breaths, you would come back to us. Your child taken from womb, born into violence. They found your body, wrapped in garbage bags, discarded like the trash littering the lands. But they didn't know, when they dumped you in the river, they placed you back in that sacred life source. They didn't know your spirit would call out, bringing the people together again. In the old days, they used to hunt our women down, sometimes in the night, other times during raids, massacres in the name of land theft, breasts used as war trophies, afraid of the power we hold, birthing new generations. In the old days, they used to steal our babies, slash them out of bellies of their mothers, left for dead. Other times rounded up, taken from families raised as if they were property, children used as trophies of conquest, afraid of the power they hold, carrying on ancestral teachings. Nowadays, they shoot our children in the streets, sell them to those working the oil fields, the mines, the corporate offices, or those who just thirst for another taste of conquest. Nowadays, they wrap our women in plastic bags, hold them in basements, in barns, in abandoned shacks, or wherever no one will hear their cries. Still a trophy held by those hungry for dominance and control. In reality, the old days are the nowadays, a story that has never ended, an extension of manifest destiny, that self-proclaimed destiny separated from earth and from spirit. Yet we remain despite the terror and the horror. We remain connected to past and future. We remain powered by prayer and by spirit. We remain unbroken. And I wrote that poem for Savannah, LaFontaine, Grey Wind, and all the other murdered and missing Indigenous women that are out there. That's why there was a content warning, y'all. This is a really heavy subject, and I really want you all to take care of yourselves as needed, and just hang on as we go through all this. On the screen, you can see pictures of several missing persons. This is like a tiny, tiny little representation. As I'm talking about this subject and I start talking about numbers, I want you to remember that every single one of those is an actual person. And statistics sometimes hide the humanity of a crisis like we're talking about tonight. But they all have their own stories, their own families, and their own communities. Oh, we already did this. That's me. Okay, for this, before I get started into some of the other pieces, I want to go over some terminology, because sometimes when we use words, it means something different to people depending on the context of what they're hearing. And so I wanted to tell you all what I mean by the words I'm using in this presentation. So for Indigenous, I'm talking about the original people of these lands. It's not a term to supersede tribal, nation, or community words for specific populations. So we all have our own names for ourselves too, but when we're talking about a general topic like MMIW, it's a blanket topic using the term Indigenous. And when I talk about women, woman, and girls or girl, I'm talking about a gender identity, which is not the same as sex assigned at birth. I hope you all are learning that, already know that. And when I talk about women and girls, it always includes trans women and girls who are part of this crisis as well. And Two-Spirit is a contemporary umbrella term for use only by Indigenous folk within the LGBTQI2S+ community as a unifier. Like the term Indigenous, it's not a term that's supposed to swap out tribal-specific or community-specific words for one's identity, but it's a term to acknowledge identity and responsibilities as a unifier term. And settler colonialism is the process of going to a land and asserting one's own governing structures, belief systems, and norms as superior while striving to replace existing systems. Definitely not the same as immigration. That's why saying the US is a nation of immigrants is super problematic, because it's actually a settler colonial nation. Oops. This is a very touchy mouse, but so thanks for your patience. Another one that I want to kind of make clear in this presentation is you'll hear me use the word crisis. A lot of times people use the word epidemic when talking about MMIW. And Sarah Deer, she's a legal scholar that started talking about some of the problem with using the word epidemic with violence against Indigenous women. And so I'm going to read this quote from her book, The Beginning and End of Rape, Confronting Sexual Violence in Native America. She says the word epidemic also suggests a short-term isolated problem. Using the word epidemic deflects responsibility because it fails to acknowledge the agency of perpetrators and those who allow the problem to continue. The word also utterly fails to account for the crisis root in history and law. And so as we're talking about this, you'll see that intertwined there. And the other part is that the connotation of the word allows society to absolve itself of blame. And I thought I'd pull up the elements of the crime of genocide that the UN uses from their Office of Genocide Prevention and Responsibility to Protect. And I really want you all to think about these different elements as we're going over the rest of this presentation and ask yourself how it's showing up, how it showed up in the past, and how some of these elements, are all of them, continue to show up today. and kind of center it in that kind of framework. Okay. And so for a historic overview, what you need to know, like this is a very historic issue that has started since contact. The way that settler colonialism works globally, usually rape is used as a tool of conquest and control. And that was the same in the Caribbean when Columbus landed and started the transatlantic trafficking and enslavement of indigenous people going to Europe. And most of those were younger people, along with the sanctioned gendercide that was happening in the Caribbean that spread up to the United States and Mexico and Canada and South America as well. It all started from contact, and there's plenty of documentation about that, which I would encourage people to take a look at if you want to know more. It's all in his logs and his journals and everything. But really, it was instilling a patriarchal norms of governance and disregard for women and Two-Spirit people's political autonomy. It's when people came to these lands and seen women and Two-Spirit people in positions of political power and having agency, it was a direct threat from the settler colonial nations that were trying to instill their ways here. And so one way to sort of attack the indigenous peoples and take over governing systems and just whole societies was through gendercide because of that threat of women and Two-Spirit people in particular. So this is a little bit about gendercide in the context of mostly North America and the way that women and Two-Spirit were targeted and viewed as uncivilized, sinful, and conquerable. And by attacking the very roots and foundations of the whole system of women and Two-Spirit people being centralized, it destabilized entire political systems, governing structures, and societal norms. And it not only did that, but instilled a great sense of fear within communities. So that picture that is on the slide right now is an etching of the dogs of war, Balboa's dogs of war attacking a group of, it's called Balboa's dogs attacking a group of Panamanian sodomites. So basically literally feeding Two-Spirit people to dogs in front of their entire communities. And that kind of violence created the fear, the disassociation from one's own identity and also from one's own community members. And there was no accountability, there still isn't, for the gendercide by colonizers. And all of these things set the stage for ongoing gendered violence across centuries. Oops, see, this thing goes fast. Okay, there we go. Sometimes I show video clips too. I'm not going to do that tonight, but basically, I'm sure most of you have heard of Pocahontas or heard of the Disney movie. Perhaps you have seen it, and I really hope you know the false narrative that it surrounds that movie. And you may also hear stories about Sacagawea as being this woman who led Lewis and Clark. What's really important about both of these women's stories is they were both children and teens at the time their stories actually happened with contact with European settlers, and they were taken, abducted, traded, assaulted, and married to grown men that were in their 30s. Some of the stories that are told about Pocahontas is that John Smith was like 34 or 32, somewhere around there, and she was 10 when they met. So even if his story is made up, it completely is kind of gross, right? Because he's still telling a story about being this love story with a 10-year-old, basically. And that says a lot. And the same with Sacagawea. She was like 12 when she was kidnapped and sold when she was 14 to that French trader guy. But they're always depicted as full-grown women. And what that does is it creates this normalization of violence of like young girls are actually grown women. And it creates a story about kidnapping and rape becoming a love story, which is really not cool. And then forced servitude and assimilation becoming a story of bravery. children become women, and then there's this whole national imaginary created to absolve colonizers from responsibility. Because if you can erase that violence and replace it with something that's very romanticized, then it's not that big of a deal anymore. And not only that, but the silence around these violences is normalized, and it's also expected. You're expected not to talk about these topics, and you're expected not to be able to speak up or even tell your own story. Okay, I need to figure out how to do this slower. I did it, okay. But really, this gendercide in Indigenous communities, it really needs to get talked about, not only within our communities, because it doesn't actually get always talked about within our communities, but also outside of our communities. But the main thing, this isn't a new crisis. Hopefully that's clear now. This is a historic, ongoing issue. And then some of it is young girls and teens are framed as adults to avoid talking about pedophilia and child rape, which is a really big deal in the United States and other countries as well. And kidnapped and trafficked people's stories are reinvented by dominant discourse. And we hear this happen time and time again in current times when Indigenous women and girls go missing, is like, oh, you know how those Native women are, they like to party, or she's just out doing her thing. Grown women can disappear if they want, all of those things that come in to the conversations that prevent searches from happening. And that silence is really intentional, because if you don't talk about it and you don't break down what's happening, it continues. And so I decided to bring in the word complicit to this presentation tonight. And so the definition, according to the dictionary, is helping to commit a crime or do wrong in some way. So when I was preparing for this, I was thinking, like, what does it mean to have the settler nation of the United States complicit in this MMIW crisis, like completely involved with it historically and in current times, and how do we change that? And so I wanted you to keep that in mind as you look at the ways that law and policy has made all this violence continuing possible. And some of it has to do with the ongoing theft of children. And so there was, these are like old laws, but they have lasting impacts. So in 1819, the Indian Civilization Act Fund was not only passed through federal legislation, but it was funded federally to support religious groups to establish schools on reservations to help, as they were saying, civilize Indigenous children. And that really set the stage for ongoing boarding schools and church schools on Native lands. And a little bit later, California actually enacted the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians in 1850. This is really specific to California. I'm from California originally, and I didn't learn this when I was in elementary school, so that makes sense. But still, I never learned it until much later when I was doing my own research. But they had through state law the ability to remove Indigenous children and enslave them. So basically, all people had to do, and by people I mean white people, because brown and black people could not do this. They just had to go say, I'm going to provide a better life for this child, and take them from their home and go to court, and their parents had zero legal representation because they weren't allowed to. And so they put them, they literally enslaved them. I think it was till they were 30 for women. A lot of the girls that were younger ended up being like basically sex, basically they were used for sex. And it was really sad. And that continued on. California actually had to be forced to comply with the abolishment of slavery in the United States, because it was continuing practices of auction blocks for Indigenous people, including kids, and practices like this act. I think it was 17 years after it was abolished. And then the first boarding school was opened actually on the Yakima Indian Reservation in 1860, but the flagship boarding school where people were being sent off reservation was Carlisle Industrial School. in 1879. And their motto, of course, if you don't know, was to kill the Indian and save the man. And it's just this continued removal of children, separation of families, and the complete breakdown of Indigenous communities through federal law and policy, and state law and policy, actually. And the reason I'm bringing up kids is because it's all intertwined together. And I was doing this research project actually for, it was for our Ethnic Studies K-12 Institute research stuff. And I was looking at the Library of Congress maps, and if you do a search for boarding school maps, there's none. And I think that silence around that says a lot. Like, okay, so it's community organizations. You're probably not going to, you can't read all those, I know, but just so you see, because a lot of people don't know how many boarding schools there were. And so this is just the United States. There's a ton in Canada too, but there was 367 boarding schools. And that continued theft of children, by 1926, nearly 83% of school-age kids were attending boarding schools. That's a huge impact on Indigenous communities and tribal nations to have your children taken and exploited. There was a lot of sexual violence and other things going on as well that had huge ripple effects. But you can see they're spread out all over the place. There's a lot of other things that happened during this time, but for this presentation, this is one of the most important things to keep in mind of the breakdown of societies and the normalization of silence around sexual assault that was embedded in the boarding school practices because you couldn't talk about it. And so what that did is it ingrained this, like, you have to stay quiet, you can't speak it, you can't acknowledge that this exists. And we see that continue today, which contributes to the MMIW crisis as well. And speaking of, speaking of other policies and laws, in 1970 was the Family Planning Service and Population Research Act. And before that, there was already forced sterilizations happening of Indigenous women, but this was the act that actually said, do this. So it was already happening in the clinics and other places, but to have the federal go-ahead to sterilize Indigenous women started in 1970. And then the estimate, because of course nothing's tracked well with Indigenous people, even though there's plenty of data out there, they just don't like document it well. That's why the range is 25 to 50%, because that data is all over the place and people are doing independent research, like grassroots people, sort of like the boarding school one, to find out where those are. And I would imagine it's probably going to go a little bit higher too. And a lot of people don't think it still happens, but as recent as 2020, it was happening in ICE detention centers. Those are primarily Indigenous women that are trying to seek refuge, that are in those camps and or those centers. And it's an ongoing thing. So. Okay, so there's other things too that make the federal law and policy complicity piece come alive, and one of the biggest ones was the Major Crimes Act from 1855. If you don't know what that is, that completely strips tribes the authority to prosecute on their own lands certain crimes, which of course are murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, assault in general. I can't remember them all right now. There's several, but basically all the ones that contribute to the MMIW crisis, tribes have zero jurisdiction over those. And then there's other court cases and acts that both further stripped Indigenous people, tribal nations' ability to have jurisdiction, and then there's also ones that attempted to sort of restore some of that, but the main one is the Major Crimes Act in place prevents many things from happening. The VAWA, I don't know if it's on here. Yeah, it is. Okay, it's on the next one. One of the biggest things about the VAWA reauthorization of 2013 is it only allowed prosecution of non-Native people in intimate partner crimes. And so if you weren't in a situation where you were in an intimate relationship with somebody, it doesn't count. And so people were still able to go to reservations and cause harm, as in like abduct people and sexually assault them, etc. Wait, yes. Okay. So where are we now with the role of law and policy? Because that's a lot of information for y'all to take in. You need a deep breath real quick to kind of take some of that in for a minute. Okay, because I need a drink of water. Okay, so this is where we're at. There's VAWA reauthorization 2013, but it also expired. Does anybody follow federal law and policy on here? It's an interesting thing to follow, especially with tribal matters. So that's been at standstill forever. I think it made its way through partially for the reauthorization. But when that happened, it was really beneficial for some tribes to be able to prosecute non-Native people that were in intimate partner situations. I don't want to say that that didn't help, because it really helped with some domestic violence situations and sexual assault cases. It didn't really help with MMIW stuff, though, and that's the bummer part about it. In Oregon, that picture is actually from when Governor Brown signed House Bill 2625 in 2019. That House bill was to launch an investigation, an interagency investigation between city, county, state, and federal and tribal law enforcement data sets to do a comparative analysis to take a look at the depth of Oregon's MMIW numbers. The bad thing about that is that by the time the listening session started and the work happened was winter of 2020. And so that got extremely interrupted, and not all the listening sessions were able to happen, and not all the data was able to get compiled like it should, because people were isolating because of the pandemic. And there was actually a dip in trafficking of people during the spring of 2020 and early summer, then it went back up. So those numbers were a little bit all over the place anyways. And then Savannah's Act, that poem I read in the beginning, there's an act, a federal act that was passed in fall 2020 that's named after her, and that is to reform MMIW law enforcement and justice protocols at the federal level. And it passed simultaneously with the Not Invisible Act, which mandated a commission to coordinate those intergovernmental efforts. But we are in spring of 2022, and nothing has happened since. Actually, that's not true. They did a call for people to be on the Not Invisible Act Commission, but they haven't actually launched anything yet. So there's a lot of critique right now on that. Then the other thing that happened in 2020, what's interesting that these all happened during the pandemic too, is that there was, it was actually under the Trump administration, but it was really like a publicity stunt is what it seemed like. They opened what they called Operation Lady Justice. That's why it says OLJ, because I actually hate the name of it. It just sounds just really, I don't like it. But it established several MMI cold cases nationwide, and I should have put that picture in there. Those cold case offices do not correlate with the states that have high rates of MMIW statistics, so they didn't even take into account any of the data. They just opened them. And at the first office opening, they didn't even invite any of the grassroots organizing people to be at the opening of that office. And so their priorities were around like what they think should happen and where they think the need is, without actually looking at the data or working in partnership with all these grassroots people and activists that have been doing the work for a really long time now. And that's why I say I think it was really performative. It actually was really gross, because they had like headdresses on the ground and they were standing up here talking at a podium and they're like, we're doing this ribbon cutting, and it was really gross. People were mad. I was mad. I wrote a whole thing about it. So all of the data, like I said, is all over the place. Nobody is compiling it. The United States does not have a good data set at all. And there's absolutely no reason why there shouldn't be a good data set, because there's data everywhere. Everything is tracked. And some of it has to do with misgendering and misracing Indigenous women too, so they slip through the cracks a lot. But a lot of it has to do with just not putting the effort and resources into compiling everything. And so what happens a lot of the time is that it's grassroots organizers that are compiling data sets, and in some instances having to share those with state and federal agencies as well. I'm going to show you this graph. Oops. Not necessarily for the numbers. This is from Canada. When MMIW started in Canada, which is actually where the whole movement started through, it's on the next slide, but I'll tell you now. It started up there from Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people wanting to know where their loved ones were, what happened to them, and hold the Canadian government accountable. They were able to work with them because they did it. They actually did a truth and reconciliation kind of effort. They actually acknowledged like the genocide, even though there's still a lot of work to do in Canada. But this is, excuse me, this is part of their Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's federal page, and it shows the trends. And so what I want you all to look at is that it's not getting better, it's getting worse, if you see the numbers on the graph. And some of that has to do with they're like, oh, the data numbers, but it's actually because there's an increase in these cases. And they don't have anything past, looks like 2019 on there, and they only have 307 profiles on their page. And those are mostly unsolved cases. And if that's happening in Canada at that rate, that's happening in the United States, and it's happening in Mexico actually at way higher rates. So I already told you a little bit about how MMIW started. I have permission to use MMIW USA's logo to kind of like draw attention to some of the work they do. But Canada launched that investigation in 2016, and then the hashtag MMIW that you see on social media or like on my shirt or where people wear it and stuff like that, it was used to help spread awareness quickly, just like that's what hashtags do, right? And it's moved down to the United States. And MMIW USA specifically is based out of Portland, Oregon, and they formed in 2013. And they help families with searches and recoveries, and they've also branched out to prevention through a program called Staying Sacred. But the main thing with that is a lot of times people are like, who looks for these missing people? Because most of the cases are not taken. Over 70% of cases that the feds have authority over in general on tribal lands are declined. And so it's left to families, and a lot of times they're left with the choice of, do I eat dinner tonight, or do I put gas in my tank to go look for somebody? And they're going to put gas in their tank. And what they do is they help with some of those searches. And in the awesome event they find somebody, they'll help bring them home too. And in the unfortunate incidences where they do find bodies, they help recover those as well through some of their efforts. And so it's very on the ground, working really closely with families. Some orgs don't do that, but they do. And their prevention part is about supporting Native youth in understanding how to protect themselves, but also how to speak up when they see stuff happening. But really, MMIW is an international movement at this point. The organizers are usually women, Indigenous women, and Two-Spirit people, and it's across Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So a lot of times people are like, well, what's going on in the United States? Or they'll see MMIW images and it only shows Canada in the United States, and it's like Mexico is part of North America too and has the same problem. And the numbers down there are significantly higher, and there's a huge MMIW efforts going on now down there as well. And some of those efforts are kind of joining up right now too. So when I was talking about data stuff, I'm going to show you a graph too. This is from one of their grant reportings for young people, because it's a lot of the cases are actually youth. And so I know it's a little blurry, but you get the point with the numbers, right? That you can see the trends. These were the number tracks from MMIW USA, where you can see in 2020 during the pandemic what I was talking about, how it dips down. and then it goes back up in the summer. And so some of that had to do with Canada opening its borders again because of the trafficking that goes through I-5. So I-5 and 84 in Oregon are the major trafficking corridors in Oregon. And then the highest county area with trafficking is actually around Burns, which is really random, but it makes sense because it's so remote. But what you can see here is in the entire year of 2020, there was not less than 20 cases of young people that they tracked. And that's only their tracking. That's not all of them because they can't track everybody. They only have the numbers that they have. So, thought I was going to talk a little bit longer, but getting close. Oh, there it is. This is a lot of number information, lots to take in, lots of stories, but one of the things I want us to come back to as you're like sitting with all this information, it's like probably a lot to process, is to come back to those elements of the crime of genocide and kind of sit for a minute. I'm going to give you like just 30 seconds or so to kind of think of like how you've seen these show up in what I've said so far. Can you all read those okay with the bars on the screen? Okay. So where did you see it show up in law and policy, in practice, in just the creation of societal norms? Is it historic? Is it contemporary? Is it both? And as you're sitting with that information, I'm going to read you another poem that I wrote when I was in Michigan a few years ago. Walking down the road in East Lansing, snow crunching beneath my feet, listening to the night sounds, laughter in the distance, alert, aware of cold. How many sisters have walked alone, that crunching sound beneath their feet, that distant laughter coming closer with each step. The coldness crawls into your clothes, cold, alone with each step. I read a story of a woman found in a ditch earlier that day. Not here, but it could have been. Have you seen the report of murdered and missing Indigenous women in urban areas? This isn't just a res problem, just an Indian problem. It's just a problem. That woman was found in a ditch not far from a town. Her name added to the ever-growing list of lost sisters. Her name not added to any statistics. Too far away from the borders of jurisdictional tracking. Another Indigenous sister discarded, tossed aside like something to dispose of. The snow crunches beneath my feet, each breath, each step, a gift. I've read that report and many others. The article says she died of exposure, left alone out there. But no one really ever knows exactly what happens. Have you seen the prosecution rates? She is one of how many? How many sisters until it ends? The bite of the cold tells me of the pain she felt. The crunch of the snow makes the same sound no matter what lands on it. I keep walking, step after step. I search for that story, Indigenous woman found in ditch. Article after article floods my screen. In ditches, in garbage cans, in rivers, in basements, on bedroom floors, discarded, left alone. The snow crunches beneath my feet, and those are only the ones they found. The snow crunches beneath my feet, heavy with responsibility. The snow crunches beneath my feet. We are more than disposable objects of desire. The snow crunches beneath my feet as I keep walking down this path, walking towards change, walking towards healing, walking for them, walking with them. The snow crunches beneath my feet. I listen to what it tells me, what it teaches me. I keep walking. So how do we move from trauma to action, right? Because that's a lot, right? Like I live with this data and these experiences being an Indigenous woman, like every single day. I have daughters, I know they live with it. I have family members. But one of the things when we're thinking about going into action is to think about who sets the ground rules. Like why is the settler state allowed to continue these types of implicit or complicity through the legal system and through their actions in general? And what parameters are being set in this process? Who decides what our lives are worth as Indigenous women? And how do we recenter healing and transformative practices? So this is a lot of sad, I understand that. So how do we recenter like that healing piece and that transformative process? It's something we have to start looking at as well. And we need to ask ourselves what needs to be changed systematically to view Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people as more than victims and tragedy. Like, what do we need to do that? Like, when you think about Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people, do you think of those sad statistics? Because they're horrible. Like, I could have did a whole data dump, like the 10 times more likely to be murdered kind of data and more than 1 in 3 data for sexual assault. But I want us to be viewed as more than that because we are. And we're doing this kind of work like Indigenous women are to help educate people, but we also want your help in helping create systematic change. There's not a ton of Indigenous people left because of the whole genocidal acts of the United States and other countries, but there are a lot of us left in many ways too, and we really need to work in partnership to help recenter what we need to change with the settler state. So how you can help, some tangential ways, because this is something people always ask is like, what can I do? This is really messed up, y'all. But then people want to know, like, what can I actually do? You can advocate for local and national laws and policies being developed. And an example is, like I talked about, VOW was not reauthorized yet, so can you write to representatives and people, like send them a little email or a letter or something like that to help say, like, what's going on with this? Where do you stand with that? And keep an eye on what's going on, because the new VAWA package actually has an entire MMIW component in it. And so I think when they were looking at it originally, when it first came up in 2019, it was a lot of things being said like, oh, how are non-Native people going to get a fair trial on tribal lands? So like, how do we protect white men on tribal lands, basically, because they didn't think they would get fair trials. And so that was some really ugly, damaging language that was being used to help kind of put VAWA down. But you could also speak up when gendered stereotypes are arising. So are you seeing like the over-sexualization of Indigenous women? And are you saying anything when that's happening? And following groups doing the work on social media, if you use it. They also have, a lot of people have listservs so you can continue to get information. And definitely sharing information about missing people, because it literally saves lives. One of the stories that Deborah Maytubi from MMIW USA talks about is there was a missing person. She was a white lady and was getting a lot of news coverage. It wasn't, I can't remember her name right now. It wasn't that one. It was a local one in Oregon. And Native women don't get news coverage at all. I don't know if you all have noticed, but there's like nothing with all these cases. But they have been sharing like the missing persons flyers in the comments on social media and other places. And a group of truckers seen it and actually found that person because it was in the comments. And so that's one example of it working. And there's other times where it has too, but they're getting really creative of trying to get the information out there. And whatever you do, please continue to learn more beyond this session. Like, don't let this be the last time you learn about this or even think about it. Like, some people can leave this room and never think about this again. That's not the case for me and a lot of other people. And here's a few organizations to follow if you're into following people or if you want to get on listservs. There's MMIWSA. There's also Sovereign Bodies Institute. They're based out of Northern California. Yeah, you could take a picture of it. And they do a lot of the California cases and also like the data combs through urban areas. They have their own reports out. The Urban Indian Health Institute is based out of Seattle. And they also, they did the first urban area MMIW data set comb and found out like the top 10 cities and stuff like that. And that's available online. And they also have a lot of information, education, and everything. And even though I don't like the name, OLJ has a listserv, so you can get updates on what they're doing, which is not much lately, but they do have a listserv because I read their newsletter. And then I put a couple other things on here that came up too, like the National Native American Boarding School Healing Project, if you want to learn more about that, and also the National Immigrant Justice Center, since we talked about the sterilizations in the ICE detention centers. I think I talked a little bit faster than I meant to, sorry all, but, and sometimes people want to know, like, do you have anything out? Because we're at school right now, if you need something to cite, there's some of my articles, y'all, if you're interested. The cold case offices are covered in that 2020 and elections can't stop us one, and then the other one's about VAWA, and then the other one's just my thesis. But there's some information, and I'm going to start wrapping it up to Q&A. Sorry, it was short. Yes. I don't know if people have questions. Are you all still soaking in the info so you don't have questions? Or was I so good at presenting it you have no questions? Because I know that's not true.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for this presentation. In this age of super communication that we have, I'm wondering if there can't be more done to get the story out. It is true that this is a remarkably poorly covered story as far as certainly as the broad population is concerned. Mm-hmm. What can be done to get it out better? What can be done in terms of working with various news networks, with personnel who might be particularly concerned and sympathetic, etc.? Some sort of grassroots activity in that respect.
Yeah, there's one news person out of like the Tri-Cities area. She's a woman of color, of course, and that's who's covering it in the Northwest, but nationally there's not much. And I think just creating that pressure of why it's important, if you are going into like journalism or something, that's another way to help get the word out too, is like make it important. And I think what happens sometimes is people get really overwhelmed and they're like, that's really sad. And now I'm just gonna turn away because it was too much. And that's what happens with some of the news coverage too. Once there's been a couple things that came out nationally, and people are just like still blown away. It kind of blows me away that people don't even know about this still. And I'm like, how? It's so prevalent. Like, how do you not know? But it's because of the media, like you said. So just pressuring people and requesting stories like over and over again just to get ran. It shouldn't be that hard to do like a major missing persons kind of case. Like, Ashley Loring from Montana had no coverage, and they were asking forever, even though there was like people had seen her disappear with somebody and stuff. And yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, yes?
Yes.
Thanks so much for talking about this and for doing such a thorough job. I'm interested in coalition, and I know you mentioned that this issue and responses to this issue have been kind of across North America, right? So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, about like how, if you know about how coalition has happened around this issue with the MMIW and like the groups that are trying to stop it, raise awareness, et cetera. And then, and this might be like, I kind of know what you're gonna say, but I'm still gonna ask. I wonder if there has been any work done with like mainstream, white stream feminist groups and, like sexual violence prevention and these kinds of things to like also advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm thinking about like the Women's March and stuff, and was that even like, were Indigenous women even like an issue that was brought up during that time? Yeah, does that make sense? So, like,
It totally does. I was like, you already know what I'm going to say. It's not.
Right, I do, but I still want to hear you say it.
Yeah, no, there's not very much inclusion. It's kind of messed up though, because a lot of times it becomes this like, well, we don't know what to do, so we're not even going to talk about it, instead of just like talking about it and like how do we help build those coalitions, because it just doesn't happen with like white stream feminism basically. And it's unfortunate, and especially like with all the with the women's rallies and marches that first year, it was really bad because there was like nothing, no inclusion or anything, or even conversations like with the takeover of the Me Too movement. It's like there was no Indigenous women's voices brought into that either, and coupled with the silencing of Black women's work and stuff. But it's really unfortunate. But we need more coalition building though, for sure. And people just need to reach out. There's plenty of people doing the work, and that's the other thing, is a lot of times people are like, we don't know who to contact, and it's like, there's a lot of people to contact. There's a lot of grassroots organizing going on around this. And then the first question was about what's happening.
Yeah, like coalition, like across North America. Like, I know there's a lot of activism and like awareness raising around the femicide in Mexico. And so I wonder if there's, like you mentioned, a lot of the women being murdered in Mexico are also Indigenous, and I'm sure Mestizas too. So I wonder, like, is there like an intentional coalition?
It's getting there. That's one of there's two things that I've been heavily working on with MMIW USA. One is like the Two-Spirit inclusion piece, and then the other is like reminding people it's a continental thing, not like Canada and the United States. And so there's been a lot of movement on that, and like reaching out to people, because some of the cases, especially like in Southern California and Texas and stuff, you have to work in coalition with the grassroots work going on in Mexico. And so some of that's actually starting to happen. And I'm really think it's going to be a game changer if they continue to build alliances with the different orgs across that geopolitical border. It already happens with Canada. And a lot of it is like based on the complexities around like nationhood with Canada and the United States versus like not having that same kind of status in Mexico for Indigenous folks. So, but that work is starting to, and especially with that newscaster that I was telling you all about, she covers a lot of stuff like on Telemundo and stuff like that, and helps raise awareness for the women doing the work down there. I can't remember some of their names right now, but of the orgs, but yeah.
Luhui, we have a question. When MMIW USA goes and does the work and does the searching, and they find whether they find individuals alive or not alive, are there prosecutions made? I mean, does law enforcement like deal with it?
I think we all know the answer to that one. Not really.
Not really.
Not really, yeah. It's really disheartening. They do work with law enforcement, of course, because they have to, and build partnerships because there are searches that happen, but some of them there's like nothing really happens. And a lot of it's, if it's on tribal lands, it's because the feds just don't take them up because they don't have enough resources, is how it's worded. Yeah.
Like, what specific work can be done around that?
To advocate for better funding allocation for those efforts and more staff to actually do that, because there's so much crime that is like happening and exploitation that they're just not taking it up. And I think there's, let me reframe this in my mind. Okay, that needs to happen. I also personally think that the Major Crimes Act needs to be overturned and like that kind of agency granted, not necessarily granted, but restored with tribal nations because they don't have the jurisdiction to prosecute, and they would, or they would hold them accountable, whatever their traditional justice models are too. I think those need to be restored because it's not always the same as like how we think of the justice system. And that's part of why that law passed anyways in the 1800s. Because they were like, that's not legit. You can't just take care of somebody's family after you killed the guy over whatever happened. And so they were like, you don't even know how to prosecute people. You're incompetent. And so we're stripping you of your rights to serve justice in your own ways. So, yeah. Yeah, and I had a typo. I'm co-vice chair, not co-chair.
So I guess, what do you think should be done at a like K through 12 level to address the issue?
Ooh, just actually teaching accurate information and not romanticizing violence would be nice for a start, because that's a big, that happens, right, across the board, not just here, but everywhere in K-12. In my Intro to Native Studies class, I always hear people like, I had no idea this ever even happened. And there's other things that are said that I'm just like, that's so sad. I want you to learn this earlier. This shouldn't be your first time learning about this. But I think just curriculum changes, there's ways to talk about this without it feeling traumatizing too. Actually, it's hard to talk about in general, but like my kids all know about this and they've known about it since they were little because they have to. Yeah. I don't know if that's what you meant, but yeah, it just needs to be embedded in curriculum. Other questions? Okay.
Couple different terms used to refer to like indigenous people. I heard like Indian and indigenous, and a lot of the times I hear like Native American. Is there like a correct way? I know that like Indian has a much more United States kind of connotation, especially with like the National American Indian movement and stuff like that. But if I was to like write something about it or talk to people about it, like what would be the correct way to like refer to people involved in it?
Yeah, however they're referring to themselves, like a lot of people refer by their own tribal affiliations, like how I was introduced as Coastal Chumash, and that's just a blanket term, Indigenous, and this is a whole nother topic, but but like there's legal terminology too with treaties and federal Indian law that uses a terminology like American Indian, Alaska Native, that's specific to the United States, and it's the same as using First Nations and Aboriginal in Canada. It's tied to like their infrastructure language. But I would say ask somebody. But if you're writing about it, just use something like Indigenous or Native American. Don't use Indian though.
And then I was gonna ask, like I learned, especially in school, you learn like 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, stuff like that. What do you think? I didn't learn anything against that until high school when we started reading stuff like Howard Zinn. So you learn like the right version or the wrong version and the right version, and you kind of have those ideas like fighting in your head. So what would you think would be like the right time for kids to learn stuff, what you would consider like the right version of history?
I would say a more full version of history, right, is how I like to term it, because I don't like it to be like it's this versus that. It's like a more full version, and from the beginning, yeah. I used to get kicked out of class in elementary school for saying Columbus was a rapist and murderer, so kids are capable of knowing at a young age. Yeah.
We have a couple questions from our online audience. The first one, in addition to overturning the Major Crimes Act, what do you think could be done to increase tribal sovereignty around the MMIW crisis?
I don't know, because that's going to be up to tribal nations how they want to define their sovereignty, and I don't want to speak over somebody else's thoughts of what sovereignty means for their own nation. But I think, like, personally, like, having full sovereignty that's not dependent on recognition by the federal government would be a good step. Like, it's not dependent on the U.S. saying you're a sovereign nation. It's just the respect that you are a sovereign nation with no strings attached like there is in some cases.
I have a request for you to talk more about work with Two-Spirit and trans folks around these issues.
Okay, yeah, so there's a lot of misgendering that happens, especially with trans women and girls and Two-Spirit people with the MMAW data. Some of it has to do with like law enforcement records. So some of it has to, I know there was a case in Montana where MMIW USA intervened and had their gender corrected because they were using an incorrect gender for them. And so stuff like that matters, because if they're identifying like as a woman and they're on the NamUs kind of database, which is the missing persons list, they're identified as like male on there, then people aren't looking for the right person. And so that kind of stuff is really important, and something as small as like correcting somebody's gender designation on those files is a big deal. So that's some of it. And also I know that there's some data gathering going on that will help just isolate the Two-Spirit data a little bit more, but it's not out yet.
Related to that, we might have gotten it from that answer, but can you define the term Two-Spirit for those who are unfamiliar again, and explain the similarities between some of the struggles they have faced with those of Indigenous women?
Yeah, so I went over this in the beginning. I don't know if they weren't there, but it's an umbrella term that was developed in the early 90s for Indigenous people that are part of the LGBTQI2S plus community, because sometimes those terminologies don't work, and they don't also recognize some of the roles and responsibilities that come with somebody's identity. And for some people, it's their gender identity. For some people, it's their sexual identity. And for some people, it's both, or it's neither. And it's so it's confusing for people because they want like this clear-cut understanding of what it means, but it depends on the person who uses that identity label. And there's also the tribal-specific terms for people too. I don't know if that's what they're asking, but was that the whole question, or was there more?
Explain some of the similarities. Explain the similarities between some of the struggles they have faced with those of Indigenous women.
Well, Two-Spirit people are part of Indigenous women too, so all of these things are like relevant. There's more of the hiding of people's, or like hiding one's own identity, or let's see, how can I explain this? So people hiding their identities because of that fear that was created is a big one, or being forced to live an identity that there isn't truly theirs is one of the differences, because for a lot of Indigenous women, it's like you're an Indigenous woman, just like if you're a Two-Spirit, you're Two-Spirit, but it wasn't recognized as much during certain periods of time. That's a floundery answer, but it's completely tied, especially the historic part.
If people want to follow up with you afterwards, they can, it's okay to email.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
I just want to say, I'll come up here where I can be heard and I'll stand back because it was echoey when I was up here. So thanks everybody for coming in person and for those who attended online. The contact information is in the slides if you have further questions and want to learn more. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll also take my classes. Shout out for my classes. Bye. Thanks, y'all. I don't know how to turn that off.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, no problem. It was like a
Sound, yeah.
the tech complexity that might happen. So.
I know events that are, I wonder how many people are online. Like, I just don't know how, you know how that's going right now, but I'm just saying, just people aren't wanting to show up to many things.
Yeah,
I'm finding that in my work too.
I figured most of the people were online.
Hey, how's it going?
It's been okay. How are you?
I'm good.